should the first thing you play every day be scales? That's the question. I'm Drotos from KeyboardImprov. Thanks for being here. And it's a big question. So you wake up in the morning or after work, you get home, whatever it is, and you sit down, you're going to practice, and you want to do 15 minutes of scales or something. Should that be the first thing you practice or not? It's actually a huge question, and I think we can look at it in a way that really helps us with everything. Because the real issue isn't whether you should start with one thing or another. It's the fact that you've probably read that you should start warming up with scales every day to warm up, or you should play an hour of scales every day. Well, what if you only have a half hour to practice? How are you going to do an hour of scales, right? But if you have in your mind, you know, somebody's saying, I got to do an hour of scales, then you're always going to feel like you're behind, right? And who wants to feel behind? We already have enough problems as musicians, right? Dealing with, oh, I don't sound as good as I did yesterday, and how to deal about that, or get back into it, you know, after not playing for a few days. So the last thing we need is to feel guilty or not up to par by not practicing scales or enough. What does enough mean? All right, so a couple things. One is I get a lot of new piano students that say that they play scales first thing every day to warm up. Because I'll ask them, what's your practice routine, right? And my reaction to that isn't that's good or bad, but I say, well, what is your intention? What's your goal of playing scales first? Because usually, you know, if we plan something out, we have a goal, right? You know, I want to learn how to run a marathon. So I'm going to start by, say, walking 5 miles a day, right? I'm not going to just start sprinting, you know, and try to sprint for 24 or 26 miles, whatever marathon is, right? So you have a plan. You say, I want to accomplish this. What's going to get me there, right? If we're smart about it, we have a plan. So often the person will say, well, I play scales first every day to warm up, right? So I'll say, well, you can practice scales every day. That might be a good thing to start with, but not necessarily to warm up. I mean, would you warm up every day physically by sprinting for 5 miles? Yet I know people who sit down with scales and they even start them fast. First thing, I'm warming up, I'm playing scales. Well, that's not really warming up. That's trying something that should be done after you've already warmed up so you can play them cleanly. If you're going to warm now, so that's sort of the flip side, right? So maybe there's a better way to warm up. Maybe you want to warm up by playing something you already know pretty well. That's easy. You know, you sit down and you just play. You know, I don't know, Sweet Lorraine. It's a little easier on the fingers, right? That's a true warm-up. Or maybe, you know, I don't know. You know that really well. So, you know, something that you don't have to work so hard. That's a warm-up. Warm-up before a sporting practice or event would be to stretch, right? You know, or before running a race, you stretch out, do a little yoga, whatever. That's what a warm-up is, right? So scales aren't necessarily the best warm-up. Now, the interesting thing is they could be if you like to. So I read an interview with Cliburn, a virtuosic classical pianist, right? Incredible technique. He said he warmed up every day with scales, but he did it in a really smart way. He was warming up his ear in addition to his fingers. So he would play scales in thirds, where you start on C, for instance, in one hand and E in the next. But he wouldn't just start like that. He would start very slowly, incredibly slowly. And he would wait until he could, what he said was he could hear the core of the sound of that third. He heard it, warming up his ear, his connection with the instrument, the connection between his ear and his fingers, and then he would go to the next one. Okay, hear that. It gets fascinating. And then maybe after a few minutes he's going, and he does that for, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever he did on a daily basis. And then he started to do them faster, or then maybe he goes to a few written pieces and then comes back to scales, and he can do them a little cleaner at that point. I don't know, so he was using scales in thirds as a way to warm up his musicality every day, to connect with it, you know? So, you know, if your goal is to warm up, maybe you do that. Or maybe you play your favorite piece of music. So no matter what happens in the rest of the day, I've gotten some really incredible time in with my favorite piece of music for 5 minutes. That could be a warm-up. Now, what would be some reasons that you would start with scales? Well, one way would be if you truly love scales. I've gone through periods of my life where I just I loved it. I was practicing scales for an hour and a half a day, exercises, and okay, I'm gonna do that. And you let's say that invigorates you. Okay, so I'm warming up by doing something that's invigorating, giving me a sense of forward progress. I'm getting better at these. I can measure it against how I could do it yesterday. And I love playing scales. You know, I find scales relaxing because they're kind of like looking at the waves in the ocean, you know, up and down, and just sort of calming. But that would be a good way to use scales, but not just because someone told you that you had to practice scales to warm up. That doesn't make any sense, really. You know, you see where I'm getting at, I think, with this, right? What's another a reason to warm up with scales? Well, let's say your goal is to really improve your technique. And you think that scales are the way to do it because you want to combine it with really getting to know all the different keys. Okay, fair enough. So you're not going to play Chopin or Bach or something to improve your technique. At this time, you're going to play the scales, and you have limited practice time, or you don't know if you can get back to it later in the day. And you know that, okay, I've got 15 minutes before I go off and do my stuff for the day. Don't know if I'm going to come back. So at least I know I've got that 15 minutes of scales in every day, right? And then if I can do more later on, great. That's like gravy, right? That's another good reason to start with scales. But again, you're not doing it because you think you should, or somebody's telling you that worked for them, might not work for you, right? A lot of people don't like scales, or they're numbing. They make you play mechanically. Horowitz said, don't practice scales. Play pieces. George Shearing said the same thing, you know. I think Shearing said, play a lot of Mozart. You'll get your scales in, you know. You know, practice that 30 times in a row. You're learning Mozart and you're getting a scale in. Another reason people say learn scales is because it helps you learn all the different keys. Well, it does get you through every major and at least the harmonic minor scales. But I find that, you know, look at all the classical pianists who can play every scale, but they still can't improvise, right? So maybe if you want to learn the different keys, what you do is you say, okay, to warm up, kind of do what Van Cliburn did. I'm going to make a connection between my ear, my fingers, my musical brain, and I'm going to live in the key of F sharp by making up some little melodies in F sharp. And even with the left hand helps your technique. Whatever it is, rock. Rock ballad kind of thing. Again, I'm living in the scale. I'm definitely learning the key of F sharp really well, right? And then you're warming up your fingers a little, kind of like stretching before the sprint, and then you can do the major scale in F sharp. You know, so I'm accomplishing my goal of learning the keys in a much better way that also helps my improvisation, helps my fingers get warmed up. Then I can play the scales a little more cleanly and fluidly when I get there in 5 or 10 minutes. So that's how I would think about practice routines, you know, because everybody's going to give you opinions. Well, not everybody, I don't. There's other teachers, other pianists who say find your own way, right? But these are some options. You might want to do this, you might want to do that, but always think of your goal first and then structure your practice routine in a way that's going to help you get to that goal. So have fun with this. And then, you know, scales are one of those things where you want them to translate into your playing eventually. So I don't know, maybe I'll just sort of improvise a little scale-like stuff now to give you some inspiration. I'll do it in the key of F sharp. Here we go. There you go. You can learn how to do that too. Maybe you already can. Have fun structuring your piano routines, practice routines, and practicing scales.